One quiet decision can outlive an entire war. One unlocked door can become more dangerous than any battlefield. And sometimes the greatest act of courage leaves behind no medal, no newspaper headline, not even a photograph. It survives only because 3 children grew old enough to remember it. But why would an ordinary mother risk everything for children she had never met? What could make a woman choose strangers over the safety of her own family when every neighbor's window might become a witness? And what happened inside one ordinary house that remained hidden long after the guns fell silent? The answers were never meant to be found. Yet, decades later, those answers would reshape how an entire family understood the meaning of bravery. Long before anyone knew her name, Eleanor Brooks believed life was measured by quiet choices rather than loud declarations. She lived in a modest white farmhouse on the edge of a peaceful American town, where mornings usually began with the smell of fresh coffee, the creak of wooden floorboards, and the familiar rhythm of caring for 2 young children after losing her husband years earlier. Every day followed nearly the same pattern. She swept the porch before sunrise, packed simple lunches, folded laundry while a radio murmured distant news from Europe, and ended each evening with a prayer whispered more from habit than certainty. The war felt impossibly far away, carried into her home only through newspaper headlines and letters from neighbors whose sons now wore military uniforms overseas. She could not stop the fighting. She could not influence governments or generals. She believed the only battles she would ever face were paying bills, raising children, and hoping tomorrow looked much like today. Then, on an evening wrapped in cold rain and restless wind, something interrupted the ordinary rhythm of her life. A slow knock echoed against the front door. Not hurried, not desperate, just 3 careful taps that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. Eleanor glanced toward the window. No wagon waited outside. No familiar face stood on the porch. Only shadows stretched across the wet boards beneath the weak glow of a porch light. She hesitated for one long breath before reaching for the doorknob, unaware that the simple movement of her hand was quietly closing one chapter of her life forever while opening another that history itself would almost forget. Eleanor slowly opened the door no more than a few inches, keeping one hand against the weathered wood as the cold wind slipped into the hallway. Standing beneath the porch light were 3 children soaked by the rain. The oldest boy could not have been more than 10. He held the hand of a little girl whose shoes were several sizes too large, while the youngest child leaned weakly against her brother, her small coat hanging loosely around her shoulders. None of them spoke. They simply looked up at the woman with exhausted eyes that seemed far older than their years. Then the boy carefully reached inside his coat and removed a folded envelope, protecting it from the rain with both hands before offering it to Eleanor without saying a single word. She unfolded the damp paper slowly. The handwriting trembled across the page. "If this letter reaches you, it means we no longer can. These children are Daniel, Ruth, and Miriam Rosen. They have done nothing except be born into the wrong time. If there is still kindness left in this world, please let them live long enough to remember it." There was no signature, no return address, only those final words. Eleanor read the letter twice before looking back at the children. Daniel stood perfectly still, trying with all the determination a 10-year-old could gather to appear brave. Ruth shivered despite wrapping both arms around herself. Little Miriam stared at the warm light spilling from the doorway with quiet fascination, as though she had forgotten what a safe home looked like. Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken. She understood enough from the newspapers to know exactly what sheltering these children could mean. Even asking questions could place them in danger. Keeping them inside could change her family's future forever. Behind her, the clock in the kitchen ticked loudly through the silence. Somewhere upstairs, one of her own children turned over in bed, unaware that strangers now stood only a few feet away. Eleanor looked once toward the empty road stretching into darkness. No wagon, no passing traveler, no explanation, only rain falling steadily onto the porch roof. Daniel finally found the courage to speak. His voice was barely louder than the wind. "We can leave if we have the wrong house." Eleanor lowered the letter and looked at each child one more time. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped backward, opened the door completely, and moved aside. It was the smallest invitation imaginable, yet in that single quiet gesture the cold night remained outside while hope crossed the threshold. Eleanor closed the door softly until the sound of the rain became little more than a distant whisper against the windows. For several long seconds, no one moved. The children remained near the entrance, unsure whether they were truly welcome or merely waiting for instructions. Water dripped from their coats onto the worn wooden floor, forming small puddles that caught the glow of a single lamp. Eleanor disappeared into the kitchen without a word. She returned carrying 3 thick towels, placing one into each pair of trembling hands before kneeling beside little Miriam. The child hesitated only for a moment before allowing Eleanor to gently dry the rain from her hair. It had probably been many weeks since someone had cared for her with such ordinary tenderness. Eleanor warmed a pot of vegetable soup that had been prepared earlier that afternoon. The familiar aroma slowly filled the small farmhouse, mixing with the scent of wet wool and burning firewood. She sliced fresh bread, poured glasses of milk, and placed everything carefully on the table. Daniel waited until his sisters had taken their first bites before lifting his own spoon. Eleanor noticed immediately. Even after everything they had endured, he still carried the quiet responsibility of protecting them. No one hurried the meal. The room remained wrapped in silence, except for the gentle clink of silverware against ceramic bowls and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Across the table, Eleanor's own children finally wandered downstairs, rubbing sleepy eyes after hearing unfamiliar voices. They stopped halfway across the room, surprised to find strangers sitting at the kitchen table. Eleanor smiled gently and introduced them only by their first names. There were no questions about where they had come from or why they had arrived so late. Children often accepted mysteries more easily than adults. Within minutes, curiosity quietly replaced uncertainty. A small wooden toy train appeared from beneath the stairs. Miriam watched it roll across the floor with cautious fascination until Eleanor's youngest child pushed it toward her with an encouraging smile. Soon the little train traveled back and forth between children who had been strangers only moments before. Eleanor watched from the kitchen doorway, realizing something remarkable. Fear had entered her house first, but kindness was already beginning to claim more space than fear. Later that evening, after everyone had fallen asleep, she climbed the narrow staircase leading to the dusty attic. Moonlight slipped through a tiny window, revealing old trunks, folded quilts, and forgotten furniture covered with white sheets. The space was small, but it was dry, warm, and hidden from casual view. Standing alone beneath the sloping roof, Eleanor understood that the decision she had made at her front door was only the beginning. Offering shelter for one night required compassion. Finding a way to protect 3 children for weeks, or perhaps months, would require something far greater. Unwavering courage practiced one quiet day at a time. The attic became a world measured not by days but by sounds. Every creak of the staircase carried meaning. Every passing truck on the road below made 3 young hearts pause. Eleanor transformed the forgotten space with whatever she already owned. Old quilts were folded into comfortable beds. Wooden crates became shelves. A small oil lamp stood beside the window, its flame kept low enough that no light escaped after sunset. She even carried up a worn rocking chair that had once belonged to her grandmother, believing every child deserved a place that felt gentle, even in uncertain times. The rules were simple, and they were repeated every morning with calm patience. No footsteps during daylight. No voices louder than a whisper. No movement near the window unless Eleanor gave permission. Daniel memorized every rule after hearing it only once. Ruth quietly repeated them to herself each evening before going to sleep. Miriam struggled the most. She was only 5 years old, and childhood had not yet learned to understand silence. Whenever she forgot and laughed too loudly, Daniel would gently place a finger against his lips before Eleanor even reached the attic. She never scolded the little girl. Instead, she would smile softly and begin telling a story in the quietest voice imaginable until Miriam instinctively matched her volume. Slowly, silence became something the children practiced together rather than something they feared. Each afternoon, after finishing the household chores, Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs carrying books, pencils, and scraps of paper saved from old notebooks. She refused to let the war steal their education. Daniel practiced arithmetic by solving long columns of numbers across the backs of grocery receipts. Ruth carefully copied new English words beside familiar German ones, laughing whenever she accidentally mixed the two languages together. Miriam learned the alphabet by tracing each letter with her finger before writing herself. Sometimes Eleanor read aloud from classic American storybooks, changing her voice for every character until the attic filled with smiles instead of worry. Birthdays arrived quietly, but never unnoticed. When Ruth turned 9, Eleanor baked a tiny cake using carefully rationed sugar and decorated it with one small candle. There were no presents except a knitted scarf she had made from leftover yarn, but Ruth held it as though it were the most valuable gift she had ever received. That evening, after the children fell asleep, Eleanor sat alone beside the dying fire downstairs. She studied the grocery ledger resting on the kitchen table. Every week the food disappeared a little faster. Every trip into town required another careful explanation. Neighbors had begun commenting that she seemed to be buying more flour than usual. Their questions were polite, but curiosity had a way of growing quietly, much like shadows at sunset, and Eleanor understood that keeping the children safe would soon demand even greater wisdom than simple kindness. The first sign that something had changed came on a quiet Tuesday morning when Eleanor noticed a dark sedan slowing in front of her house before continuing down the country road. It did not stop. It did not return that afternoon. Yet its appearance lingered in her thoughts long after the dust had settled. By evening, she found herself listening more carefully than usual to every unfamiliar engine and every voice carried by the wind. The attic remained silent. Daniel had become remarkably skilled at keeping his sisters occupied with whispered games that required no movement beyond the small patch of sunlight crossing the wooden floor. Eleanor admired him more with each passing day. Childhood had asked too much of him, yet he answered with patience instead of fear. 2 mornings later, while hanging freshly washed sheets on the clothesline, Eleanor heard footsteps approaching through the gravel. It was Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm carrying a basket of homemade preserves. She smiled warmly, but her eyes wandered toward the house. "You seem busier these days," she said gently. "I could have sworn I heard children laughing yesterday afternoon." Eleanor returned the smile without hesitation. "The radio drama was louder than usual," she replied. "My own too could not stop laughing." Mrs. Patterson accepted the explanation with a pleasant nod, yet she remained only a moment longer than she normally would have. After she disappeared down the road, Eleanor gathered the laundry before it had completely dried, her hands moving with quiet urgency. That evening she carried supper to the attic as always, but this time she spoke more softly than ever. "From now on," she whispered, "we have to become even quieter." Daniel understood immediately. Ruth looked toward the tiny window without saying a word. Miriam simply reached for Eleanor's hand. The following afternoon, another unexpected knock echoed through the farmhouse. Eleanor's heart seemed to pause between one beat and the next. Standing outside was a county utility worker carrying a clipboard. He apologized politely before explaining that he needed to inspect electrical lines serving several nearby homes after recent storms. Eleanor stepped aside with calm courtesy, though every instinct urged her to refuse. As the man slowly examined the first floor, the old staircase leading upward gave a faint creak beneath the shifting weight of the attic. Eleanor looked toward the ceiling without moving her head. The inspector paused for the briefest moment, listening. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he asked, "Do you keep anything up there?" Eleanor answered with complete honesty, "Only old memories." The man smiled politely and continued writing on his clipboard, but Eleanor could not tell whether he believed her or whether he had simply chosen not to ask another question. The utility truck disappeared beyond the bend in the road, yet the silence it left behind felt heavier than its engine had ever sounded. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window for several minutes, watching until even the dust settled back onto the gravel. Only then did she climb the narrow attic stairs, carrying a small basket of apples and bread. Daniel was waiting near the top step before she reached it. He had heard every floorboard below, every unfamiliar voice, every pause in the conversation. Did he know? He asked quietly. Eleanor looked at the boy for a long moment before answering. I do not think he came looking for you, she said. But from today forward, we must never depend on what other people do not notice. The words settled over the room with quiet weight. That evening they practiced moving through the attic without making a sound. Daniel showed Ruth how to place each foot along the stronger wooden beams. Miriam turned it into a game, pretending the creaking boards were little streams that had to be crossed without making a splash. Eleanor smiled as she watched them. Even caution could become childhood when guided with enough patience. The days continued their careful rhythm. Every morning Eleanor prepared breakfast for her own family before carrying another tray upstairs once the house was still. Every afternoon she taught reading, arithmetic, and simple geography using an old map that had once hung in her late husband's study. Daniel became fascinated by the oceans separating nations. Ruth preferred poetry, carefully reading each line until it sounded like music. Miriam loved drawing. With the last pieces of colored pencil Eleanor could find, she filled scraps of paper with bright houses, gardens, birds, and enormous blue skies untouched by clouds. One afternoon, Eleanor noticed something missing from every drawing. There were never any fences. There were never any locked doors. That evening, after the children had gone to sleep, Eleanor carefully folded the drawings into a small wooden box beneath her bed. She could not explain why, but they felt important. They were proof that hope still imagined tomorrow differently than yesterday. A week later, while buying flour at the general store, Eleanor overheard two customers discussing families who had quietly taken in strangers fleeing the war overseas. Some praised their compassion. Others questioned whether such risks were wise. Eleanor kept her eyes on the sack of flour resting on the counter and said nothing. She understood that courage was rarely loud. More often it looked like paying for groceries, smiling politely, returning home before sunset, and preparing another ordinary supper that would quietly feed more people than anyone outside her front door could ever imagine. Winter slowly surrendered to spring, and with the changing season the world outside the farmhouse seemed determined to remind everyone that life always searched for a way forward. Tiny green shoots pushed through the damp earth beside the porch. Birds returned to the maple tree outside the attic window, building nests one careful twig at a time. Miriam loved watching them. Every morning, she counted how many times the mother bird returned with food, whispering the number so softly that only Ruth could hear. Eleanor often stood beside the window for a quiet moment before beginning the day's lessons. Nature seemed to understand something people often forgot. Survival did not happen all at once. It arrived one small act at a time. News traveled more frequently through the little town as the war drew closer to its uncertain end. Neighbors gathered outside the general store, discussing newspaper headlines, troop movements, and hopeful rumors that peace might finally be within reach. Eleanor listened politely, but rarely offered an opinion. She had learned that silence could protect far more than words ever could. Inside the farmhouse, another kind of future was quietly taking shape. Daniel had grown taller. His English became smoother each week, though he still spoke carefully, as if every word deserved respect before being released into the air. Ruth had filled nearly an entire notebook with poems about gardens, rainstorms, and birds she could only observe through a small attic window. Miriam's drawings became brighter, filled with smiling faces standing beneath enormous skies where every door remained open. One afternoon, Eleanor carried a small potted tomato plant upstairs. She placed it near the window where sunlight lingered longest. "Every home deserves something alive," she said with a gentle smile. The children took turns watering it with remarkable care, celebrating each new leaf as though it were extraordinary. Weeks later, the first tiny yellow blossom appeared. Miriam clapped both hands over her mouth to keep herself from laughing too loudly. Daniel simply stared at the flower before quietly saying, "It trusted this place enough to grow." Eleanor never forgot those words. Then, early one calm morning, the familiar sound of the radio drifted from the kitchen while Eleanor prepared breakfast. The announcer's voice carried unusual emotion, speaking of victories overseas, cities being liberated, and the growing belief that the long conflict was nearing its end. Eleanor stood motionless beside the stove, wooden spoon still in her hand. Upstairs, the children waited without understanding every English word, but they recognized hope when they heard it. For the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, the future no longer felt like an impossible dream hidden behind attic walls. It felt close enough that all 5 of them were almost afraid to believe it. 3 days later, the farmhouse woke to a morning unlike any that had come before. Church bells rang across the valley, first from the white steeple in town, then from another congregation several miles away, until the sound rolled gently across fields still wet with spring dew. Cars passed along the country road with flags tied to their windows. Neighbors stepped on porches, smiling through tears they had held back for years. The radio confirmed what everyone had been hoping to hear. The war in Europe was finally over. Eleanor did not cheer immediately. She quietly turned off the stove, folded the kitchen towel over the sink, and climbed the familiar attic staircase one careful step at a time. She opened the small wooden door and simply smiled. Daniel looked in her eyes for only a second before he understood. Ruth pressed both hands against her mouth. Miriam stared in confusion until Eleanor whispered the words she had waited so long to say. "You do not have to hide anymore." None of the children moved at first. Freedom sounded almost too wonderful to believe. It had become easier to trust routine than hope. Eleanor gently held out her hand. One by one, they followed her downstairs, passing through rooms that had once been forbidden territory during daylight. At the front door, she paused before turning the handle. Sunlight poured across the porch, brighter than any of them remembered. Daniel stepped outside first, breathing deeply as though he wanted to remember the feeling forever. Ruth lifted her face toward the warm breeze with closed eyes. Miriam laughed without covering her mouth for the first time in many months, her joyful voice floating freely into the open air. Eleanor watched quietly from the doorway, realizing she had almost forgotten how beautiful ordinary sounds could be when they no longer carried fear. During the following weeks, relief organizations helped reconnect families scattered by the war. Records were searched, letters crossed oceans. Patient people worked through endless lists of names, hoping to reunite those who had survived. Eventually, relatives of the Rosen children were located, distant cousins who had also endured years of uncertainty and were now building new lives. The day they arrived at the farmhouse was filled with long embraces, grateful tears, and words that often failed where emotions spoke more clearly. Before leaving, Daniel placed the little wooden toy train into Eleanor's hands. "Keep it here," he said softly. "If another child ever needs this house, they should know someone waited for them with kindness." Eleanor closed her fingers around the worn wooden wheels, unable to answer for several moments because sometimes gratitude was too large for language, and silence remained the most honest reply. Many years passed, and the little farmhouse slowly surrendered to time, just as every old home eventually does. The white paint softened beneath countless summers. The maple tree beside the porch grew tall enough to cast afternoon shade across the front steps, where Eleanor often sat with a cup of coffee after her children had grown and started families of their own. The attic remained almost untouched. The rocking chair still rested beside the small window. The wooden shelves remained exactly where they had always been. Inside a carefully kept box lay a handful of color drawings, a faded notebook filled with poems, and one small wooden toy train whose wheels had become smooth from loving hands. Eleanor never displayed them for visitors. She never told neighbors what had happened beneath her own roof. To most people, she was simply remembered as a kind widow who baked excellent bread, volunteered at church dinners, and always found time to help anyone who knocked on her door. Then, nearly 50 years after that rainy evening, three familiar faces returned to the farmhouse. Daniel stepped out of the first car with silver hair and gentle eyes that still carried the quiet determination of the little boy who had once protected his sisters. Ruth arrived carrying a worn notebook she had preserved through every move of her adult life. Miriam, now a grandmother herself, paused at the porch before placing one hand against the weathered wooden railing as though greeting an old friend. Eleanor was no longer there to welcome them. She had passed away peacefully several years earlier. Her children opened the front door instead, inviting the visitors inside without fully realizing how deeply their lives had already been connected. Together, they climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. Sunlight entered through the same small window, falling across the rocking chair exactly as it had decades before. Daniel stood silently for a long moment before speaking. "This room gave us tomorrow." No one answered because no better words existed. Before leaving, the three siblings placed a framed family photograph beside the wooden toy train. It showed children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren standing together beneath bright summer skies. Dozens of lives filled the picture. Every smile traced back to one quiet decision made by an ordinary woman on an ordinary night. History often remembers battles, famous leaders, and dates carved in a stone. Yet some of its greatest victories happen behind closed doors where no audience is watching. Eleanor never carried a title that made headlines. She never asked to be remembered. She simply refused to let fear have the final word. In the end, she did not change the entire world. She changed one small corner of it so completely that generations who had never heard her voice were able to live because she listened to her conscience instead. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary.